Good evening and welcome to Reproaction's Act and Learn webinar for February 2019. Tonight's topic is incredibly important in the reproductive justice community and all over the United States, and that is supporting people living with HIV and AIDS. So first we'll introduce your host. The first voice you're hearing is myself. I'm Erin Mattson over there on the left. I'm based in Arlington, Virginia, and I'm proud to be one of the co-founders and co-directors of Reproaction.
And the next voice you're hearing is Pamela Merritt. I am based in St. Louis, Missouri, and I am also a proud co-founder and co-director of Reproaction. So let's go through some logistics first, which is, we have this nifty agenda where we're going to be introducing Reproaction for people who are not familiar with our organization. Then I'm going to just do a brief introduction of the topic of supporting people living with HIV and AIDS. Then we're going to talk to our panelists. First up will be Missouri State Rep Tracy McCreery, and then Jannis Evans. And we will also talk to Devin Hursey. And after that, we will actually go through next steps of ways that you can support Reproaction. And then we're going to have time for a Q&A from attendees at the end of the webinar. If you have questions throughout tonight's webinar, you can go to your GoToWebinar control panel. There's a questions tab, and you can drop it in right there. I will get to as many of those as possible. And if you have a specific question for a panelist, you can ask specific questions, or if you have a broader question that you would like all of them to tackle, that'd be great. And then the hashtag for live tweeting tonight is going to be Reproaction.
So a bit about Reproaction. Reproaction is a group that leads bold action to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. I can't tell you how proud Pamela and I are of our left flank analysis. And when I say Pamela and myself, I mean our whole team. And our willingness to hold folks on all sides of the issues accountable, whether they're traditionally considered allies or opposition. We're known for that fearlessness. One of the tools that we have a deep commitment to in our toolbox is nonviolent direct action. We will apply bold and relentless pressure regardless of who stands in the way of increasing access to abortion and advancing reproductive justice. And with that, I'll pass it back to Pamela.
Thank you so much, Erin. So supporting people living with HIV/AIDS. Before we talk to our panelists, I just want to introduce the subject and acknowledge that tonight we are not going to be able to cover all of the limitless ways that everybody can support people living with HIV and AIDS. So what we're going to try to get through are some of the innovative ways that activists and advocates are working to support people living with HIV and AIDS. And we also want to talk about HIV criminalization laws and make sure that people understand that those laws are out there and that they have a horrific impact on people living with HIV and also on the communities and families that they're a part of. The picture that you see in front of you is from activism from the 1980s. And I'm old enough to remember some of that activism in real time. You had amazing history of organizations like ACT UP and various state-based organizations and city organizations, many of which came together from a network of friends caring for their loved ones or their partners, and then became dedicated organizations that were fighting to get access to treatment, to get access to social support, and to protect and expand the civil rights of people who are living with HIV and AIDS. Unfortunately, a lot of the laws haven't changed since the 1980s, but the activism has been amazing. And as a result, a lot of the outcome and the way that we need to frame people living with HIV and AIDS in discussions has changed. And we do need to make sure that our laws and our policies are updated to reflect that. Next slide. when we talk about criminalization and stigma, and what really comes to mind is the way that we cover the actual application of criminalization laws. And so in places like Missouri, where there's a criminal count that can go against you for not disclosing that you are HIV positive, not only does it impact people's ability to have open and honest conversations with their healthcare providers without feeling like they're going to be turned over to the authorities, but it also puts the onus on people with HIV to prove that they disclosed their status, which is so hard to even think about doing. And then the penalties are incredibly harsh and devastating, including everything from obviously jail time, but also being put on a sex offender registry. So these are incredibly detrimental laws, and particularly in states like Missouri and throughout the Midwest and the South. Missouri's fastest growing prison population is women, and women of color are obviously overrepresented in that population. This is part of that feeder process that is looping people into a criminal justice system that does very little to actually support their lives and support our communities. Next slide. So above all else, we need to eliminate stigma in healthcare around HIV and AIDS. We need to eliminate stigma when it comes to the criminal justice system and the social services system. And we need to eliminate stigma within organizing and the barriers within organizing. So as Erin said, we are proud to be a reproductive justice organization that uses intersectionality as a tool. And we need to use intersectionality to dismantle stigma as well, because there should be no silo between supporting people living with HIV/AIDS and the progressive movements that we're all a part of, and certainly no silos between that work and the reproductive justice movement. Next slide. All right, so our panel discussion, as I said, will include Missouri State Rep Tracy McCreery, and then Jannis Evans, who is retired from the State of Missouri Department of Health and Senior Services, Bureau of HIV, and is still doing amazing work. Unfortunately, Camille Rishu is not able to join us tonight, but we are able to talk to Devin Hursey, who's an advocate for public health and people living with HIV. So first up, Representative Tracy McCreery. So Representative McCreery is a Democrat who represents part of St. Louis County in Missouri House of Representatives. She was elected to her first 2-year term in November of 2014. She previously served 1 year in the House after being elected in a 2011 special election. Tracy serves as the ranking minority member on 3 House committees: agriculture policy, utilities, conservation, and natural resources. And she also serves on general laws. Tracy's background as a businesswoman and in state government gives her a very unique perspective. She's worked for 8 years as the district aide to Missouri State Senator Joan Bray, and she most recently worked for PROMO, Missouri's only statewide LGBT rights advocacy organization. Welcome, Tracy McCreery.
Well, thanks for having me. So one of the reasons I'm excited to be part of this webinar and to be working on modernizing Missouri's HIV laws is because I do have a background. I was in the pharmaceutical industry for about a decade and a half, so I kind of have a healthcare background. But also I worked for a couple years at PROMO, working on trying to reduce LGBTQ health disparities. So now that I'm in the Missouri House of Representatives, I'm really excited to have an opportunity to put all those life experiences to work.
Thank you so much. And as a Missourian, I'm proud to say that we are thrilled to have you doing this work in Jefferson City. So Tracy, if you could just tell us about Missouri's HIV criminalization laws.
Well, it's similar to what we see in a lot of other states around the country, sadly. A lot of the Missouri statutes or Missouri laws were written decades ago based on a combination of shaky science, if you will, and homophobia. So, and things, for anyone who's ever done any kind of policy making, you know that once something becomes a law and it's in statutes, it's often very hard to undo it. So that's the process. That's where we are right now in this process. Is there's an acknowledgement from my colleagues on both sides of the aisle that we need to take a look at the HIV-specific statutes on the books and look at modernizing. And of course, the devil is in the details on all of this. So, one of the things that's not included at all in the statutes is this acknowledgement that technology, including new pharmaceutical technology, has progressed beyond what we could have imagined. And, so we've got a lot of things that really impact HIV and its treatment.
Thank you so much. And then for people who aren't familiar, when we're saying criminalization, what exactly people who are charged under this law are facing? Could you just go through some of that?
Right. Well, I mean, I have conversations every day about this, about the need to update Missouri's HIV laws. And I think sometimes people think they've misheard me or misunderstand what I'm saying. So right now in Missouri, the way the laws are written, you can actually be criminalized and it's considered a felon if you know your HIV status. And so what that does from a public health standpoint is it encourages people not to get tested. So HIV criminalization is really, really bad for public health. It doesn't help anything, and it just gets in the way of prevention. So I want to get our laws to the point where knowing one's HIV status is not actually able to be used against you in a court of law. So we need to update things so that people, so that our laws reflect the current understanding of what we know from healthcare experts, both practitioners, but also from the Center for Disease Control.
Thank you for that. So you spoke about this a bit, about your work at Promo, and then obviously your professional experience with the pharmaceutical industry. But how did HIV criminalization get on your radar?
Well, I remember years ago when I was a pharmaceutical sales rep, I had a product that would have allowed for people to easily be tested to know their HIV status. And I mean, this would have been in maybe the late 80s, early 90s. I can't remember when the product came out. And I remember doctor after doctor telling me, well, my patients don't need to be tested. I don't see those kinds of patients, and so doctors were looking at their, and we were targeting OBGYNs, obstetricians, gynecologists. And what I realized decades ago was doctors were looking at their patients and making assumptions about, somebody's private life, things that they'd never had a talk with their patients about. So, and I realized, decades ago that we really go on this, that you can't just, in my opinion, everybody should be tested. Everybody should know their status so that we can all be, good citizens and also be doing healthy things for those that we love. So that's how it came on my radar.
Thank you so much. So as a Missourian, I have a little extra knowledge and full disclosure for everybody. I actually served on Promo's PAC board with Representative McCreery, and it was an awesome experience. But in the state of Missouri, people can be fired for being gay. And
right.
People can be denied access to public accommodations, and including housing, or can be asked to leave, a public restaurant. I know that there are cities that have non-discrimination laws on the book, but the reality is that there are no civil rights protections for people who are LGBTQ. So not within that, when I immediately started thinking about what are the protections for people in Missouri who are living with HIV and when they enter into the system, but also with this kind of mandatory disclosure.
Right. Well, I mean, it has, so HIV is the only disease specifically mentioned in Missouri statute. So you've got this whole big issue of what some in this work call HIV exceptionalism. So that's a huge problem. But you're right, we don't have basic protections for those that are LGBTQ Missourians. So it's a challenge. And also then you add on to this HIV criminalization that we have in our statutes, and it provides like extra stigma, if there's such a thing as being extra stigmatized, for people living with HIV who are also LGBTQ. And of course, we know that sometimes folks that are HIV positive and LGBTQ also could be a person of color or a woman, and all of these things kind of layer on, and all it does is it kind of adds fuel to the stigma against people living with HIV.
Yes, that just sounds like a horrible mix of a lack of protection and stigma. That's unreal. So, what are you and your colleagues doing here in Missouri to address our HIV criminalization law, and what kind of different groups, organizations are you partnering with?
Well, considering a lot of folks are really frustrated with state government, or with all levels of government these days, because it seems like all we elected officials do is fight with each other, I'm really proud of the work that's being done in Missouri. We have an amazing coalition led by Empower Missouri, and it's a coalition of community partners from all corners of the state, both urban, suburban, and rural partners. And I am working with, I'm a progressive legislator. I'm working with a legislator from the other side of the aisle, and we have two different versions of bills that would update Missouri's outdated laws. So what we're trying to do is get our colleagues, and we had a very, very thorough hearing on House Bills 166 and 167 a couple of weeks ago. And what we're trying to do is not only get the conversation started, but get some of this steps towards modernizing going down the road. So it's exciting for me to work on something that truly is nonpartisan, and it's all about public health and doing the right thing for the state. So it feels really good to be working on something that's just good government and good public policy.
Thank you so much for that. And that's encouraging note to wrap up this section on. So if you'll hang on, I know that we're going to have questions at the end of the webinar, but thank you so much for that wonderful detail and for the work that you do, Representative McCreery. Great. Erin.
All right, thank you, Pamela, and thank you, Representative McCreery. So now I'm very pleased to introduce Jannis Evans, who's a graduate of Washington University in St. Louis, majoring in urban and regional studies. She has worked as a case manager, an outreach testing coordinator, a health program coordinator in the Missouri Office of Minority Health, and a health educator in the Bureau of HIV, STD, Hepatitis. Recently retired from the state, Jannis now contracts with the HIV Regional Resource Network, the Federal Department of Health and Human Services, the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and several other community-based organizations. Her target populations include women of color, older adults, and faith-based organizations. She's a mother of 3 amazing women and great-girl to Gavin the Magnificent. So welcome, Jannis. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Jannis, are you on mute? Are you there? Jannis?
Okay, I'm here. See?
Oh,
that's
wonderful.
Technology. I am here. Okay, yeah, I was on mute. Sorry about that. But yeah,
no
thank
problem.
you for inviting me.
Yes, no, I'm confident that if we can conquer the technology, we can also make positive change for people living with HIV and AIDS. So with that, I will roll in. So,
great segue. Okay.
Yeah, I've got the faith. So my question for you, and you have such an impressive, long-standing background. Can you tell us, what has your role been in addressing HIV and AIDS throughout the years?
I think that, first of all, I'd always said that I had gotten tricked into this field because I was actually just helping out a friend, and it just kind of blossomed from that point on. So in my journey, I have volunteered at AIDS service organizations, done, I guess, like theatrical education for people living with HIV and just for general education purposes for people. I have coordinated testing events, just trying to get people tested. And I think my big love is testing and then just education, just like really one-on-one conversations with different communities. I love it. I like to be innovative, and just because people learn differently. So you can't just put the same stale stuff on everybody. So you really have to know your people that you're trying to outreach to, and not be condescending and not overthink, because I think sometimes when we work in agencies, we figure that everybody is like right there where we are in our thinking and blah, blah, blah. No, they're not. You know, and you just really have to be sensitive to that and be sincere. So I've done a number of things in trying to bring people in and just trying to make people understand. I think one thing I really love now, since I'm retired and I'm in that old people category, I love talking to older people about sex. I love talking to women about sex. And I love talking to pastors and people in faith communities about HIV and AIDS. And I'm very passionate about it. So even though I retired from the state, I did not retire from the work.
Thank you for that. So my next question is, in Missouri, as it's true across the nation, the criminalization of HIV and AIDS has many detrimental effects, and we've already heard about some of that with Representative McCreery. Can you speak specifically to our listeners about how the criminalization of HIV and AIDS affects Black women?
Well, I think that the fact that just HIV affecting women, period, but women of color, it kind of compounds things. And I don't think maybe it's any different for women of color than it is probably for women, period. If you are under the idea that if your status is known, someone's going to take your kids, then you may or may not get tested. As Representative McCreery said, it stops people from getting tested. It stops people from getting treatment. There's a lot of stigma in a lot of organizations and things that are like in Black churches. You know, you say HIV and everybody starts like scattering and praying and, you know, like it's the worst thing ever. We found out that pastors are uncomfortable talking about it. So we try to go in and train the pastors to not be uncomfortable about the subject. I'm so worked up right now. I'm just trying to talk about, but women of color, you're already afraid. It may be a cause of domestic violence that may occur. Somebody's holding that over your head and they're making you stay with them, or they're holding your medication back because your status could be unknown. Women of color aren't doing anything any different than any other woman, any other women in society. I think a lot of those social situations put a woman of color in maybe higher risk than maybe other populations.
Thank you for that. And before I move to the next question, just a quick follow-up. I'm quite moved by many things you said. I want to ask about this question of pastors who are afraid to talk about HIV and AIDS. What difference does it make when a faith leader, and I know you work with them directly, sees the light, so to speak, and is able to talk about HIV and AIDS more comfortably and to work with those communities? What impact does it have within the community writ large?
I think it kind of gives people the permission to be curious, or at least the permission to be accepting. A lot of times in African American communities, the pastor is the guy. You know, he's like number one. He's the answer, and they're going to do what the pastor says. So if the pastor seems to be relaxed and at least be knowledgeable about HIV, so what we usually do is go in and not go in hardcore, and it's really kind of learning the that group, that society, learning that whole religious community's ways. Can't go in hard, but you can go in and approach them as to what their faith is. If you're supposed to be a Christian and you're supposed to be forgiving, then why are you judging somebody? Okay, is judgment up to God, and then just kind of drawing them in on a level that they'll understand. That's what I'm talking about, education. You bring them in where they understand, and do it from that approach on. That's been our success. That has been our absolute success in the faith communities, just coming to them where they are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. So I want to shift gears and talk a bit about prevalence rates, and specifically, we know that Black women account for 59% of all women who contract HIV annually, although Black women are not 59% of women writ large in this country. Due to an array of factors, trans women are 49 times more likely to be living with HIV than the general adult population. And my question for you, it's two questions. Why is the rate for Black women who contract HIV so high? And why is the rate for trans women so much higher?
Okay, so the theory behind African American women having higher rates of infection than other populations, I'm going to throw out this one theory that I read that is very interesting. So you have African Americans as a subgroup of the population of the United States, and so within that subgroup, you are removing young men between the ages of, and I'll just say, just grabbing 16 to 24. You're losing these guys because of homicide, because of murder, because of jail, because of any number of reasons. They're no longer in the community. So the number of people that you have to date, if you're an African American woman in a community, starts to dwindle. And I believe I did read that African American women tend to date within the African American community. It might be a generalization, and you might jump on me for that. I'm not real sure about the facts, but I'm pretty sure that that's what I read. So now you've got a smaller pool of people to pick from. So now you've got guys who have multiple partners, and you may only have one partner, but he probably has 5 or 6 partners. Where are you at that? At that point. So now you are more exposed to STDs and to HIV because you're not outside of your circle. And that causes more. Then you have a lot of traffic in and out of jail for some of these young men in that same age group. And then the big infection rate is 25 to 44. So those are the folks that are going out and partying in clubs and all this other stuff. And if you have a very limited group of people that you see or go out with socially connected, your chances are increased, I think, for HIV, STD, and other STDs. So it's not that African American women are nastier or getting it more or doing all this or finding any kind of stereotype you want to think of when you think of HIV. I think it's just a thing of a lot of social circumstances at this point. And that's how, I think that's what drives the infection rate up. Incarceration, high incarceration rates, guys in and out. There's not that much of people aren't having those kinds of stable relationships that you may attribute to having lower numbers of HIV.
Thank you.
Okay, so trans women. Okay. The thing about trans women, I just want to throw this in too. I don't have facts necessarily about that. I don't know, Devin, if you may know more about this than I do, and so feel free. But I also think that when you have to hide something and when you have higher risk factors. If you're doing something, I think there's an African proverb that says that you cannot be healed if you do not say what your illness is. So if you're out there and you're trans, and for whatever situations, you may find yourself in higher risk situations with higher risk individuals than most of the general population.
Thank you for that. All right, so I want to encourage everyone, if you have questions for Jannis, you can type them into the chat box right now, and we'll get to as many as possible at the end. Thank you, Jannis. So appreciate that. And with that, I'm going to roll over to our next panelist, who is Devin Hursey. Devin is an advocate for public health and people living with HIV from Kansas City, Missouri, and Devin is an appointed member of the CDC HRSA Advisory Committee on HIV and Viral Hepatitis. His local and state level advocacy includes work as a peer educator at Truman Medical Center, serving as a board member for Blackout, which is an initiative serving Black, queer, and trans people, and a member of the Missouri HIV Justice Coalition, which advocates to modernize Missouri's HIV criminal statute. Formerly, Hursey has served on the Ryan White Board for the Casey Transitional Grant Area and volunteered with the Calvary Community Outreach Network. Devin, thank you for joining us this evening, and welcome.
Hey, thank you. It's good to be invited. So just a little bit about my my perspective. I really come out of the people living with HIV self-empowerment movement. And what I mean by that is that my work is all about centering the voices and the experiences of people living with HIV. So that's something that I'm very intentional about in my work. So this movement really started with the Denver Principles that were written back in the 1980s. And what that does is it really just outlines the role of people living with HIV, that we're patients sometimes, and that really it's about, kind of what I described, making sure that we are privileging the voices of people living with HIV in anything that is related to HIV, be it prevention, treatment, or anything. And then with that, a little bit later, I think in the 90s, we got something called MIPA, which is the meaningful involvement of people with HIV. And what MIPA is like, it's like a guide. It's like a blueprint for how to include people living with HIV in the planning, implementation, and evaluation of any effort that's addressing the epidemic. So, like I've been saying, anything regarding HIV, we need to make sure that we're putting those voices at the forefront. For example, if there were any project in my community that was doing HIV prevention or that was funded through public funds to do anything around HIV, I would see it as my responsibility to hold them accountable for including people living with HIV or people from their target community in every level of planning. So we're having this conversation about HIV criminalization. Me being a Black gay man, I just wanted to put a few things out there about that. So Black gay men, right now, we have the highest incidence rate, the highest HIV incidence rate in the country. And I want to say that the risk is definitely greater for trans people, especially trans people of color. I'm not familiar with that data, but I really want to acknowledge that. So some of the theories about, pardon?
Oh, no, I didn't say anything. Go ahead.
Okay. Some of the reasons for these high rates, of course, as Jannis alluded to, give me just a second. As Jannis alluded to, the sexual networks theory, which states that we're such a small community, but we have a high saturation of cases already within the demographic. So, of course, we're going to be exposed to HIV more often just because of the number of cases that already exist within our community. But with that, we know that when a person with HIV is on treatment, it takes about 3 months for them to achieve an undetectable viral load. And what that means is that there's so little of the virus in our blood that we cannot transmit the virus sexually. So what that points to is that HIV incidence is really a matter of access to health care. It's not anyone's personal sexual behaviors or anything like that. It's really a matter of access to health care. So we also see national data that lets us know that Black gay men as a demographic have the highest, they report using condoms more than any other demographic that exists, yet we still have the highest case or the highest incidence rate of HIV. So that kind of lets you know that we're doing what we can do personally, individually. So this is really an issue of structures. And then if you also consider that, you know, this demographic having such a high level of cases, we're also, just as Black people, we're also heavily policed. So I want to talk about my clients for a second. I serve a lot of people within the Kansas City area who are either new to care or newly diagnosed, and people who struggle with HIV treatment. And there's one person in particular that I want to acknowledge without any personal identifying information. So there's a woman, she's about in her 40s, I would estimate. She's newly diagnosed and new to the area. She lost her son to gun violence in Chicago, and she comes into me with a brand new diagnosis. She lost her son 2 weeks prior to her receiving her HIV diagnosis, and she comes to me, and I really have to have, you know, as best I can, a conversation with her about her body, you know, and what this means. And I know that the best thing that I can really do for her is just be present. So there's a lot of situations like that that I come across. Another Black woman. She was feeling depressed, and I walked into the room, and she just wanted somebody to talk to, but I came in there with a disclaimer. I was like, hey, I know I'm not a woman. There is a woman on staff who may be able to talk to you, and all she really wanted was someone to talk to, and that person was me at that moment. What I knew about her is that she was someone who was heavily involved in the church. And I guess part of my hesitation is that, you know, she wants some support and she has to get it from a Black gay man. So I didn't feel that I was qualified, that I was the person to give her any support, when I know that for a lot of Black women, all they really have is the church. And I don't know how I'm going to be received as a Black gay man. And you know, it's not their fault. It's just really a prejudgment that I had made. But it's really unfortunate because it's so much easier for us to talk about HIV within the LGBT community because it's such a big part of the culture and historically part of the movement. But it's definitely different for heterosexual Black women. Another young girl, I see a lot of young girls who are just very depressed, have no one to talk to but their kids. So just moving on with what I wanted to touch on, when we're talking about access to healthcare, something that we don't think about, immigrant populations, people who are undocumented in this country have to have access to healthcare. I don't know anybody who checks someone's documentation status before they engage in sex. If we do not provide undocumented people with access to healthcare, then we are creating an issue for everybody within the state. Trans people experience a lot of transphobia, a lot of other sorts of discrimination. And as a result, they have limited access to healthcare. Also, sex workers, another population that experiences a lot of discrimination. They have limited access to healthcare. Something else that I've worked on that I didn't add to my bio is that I've also contributed to the work on behalf of Michael Johnson, who is a Black gay man who was sentenced to 30.5 years within the state of Missouri exposing sexual partners to HIV, well, allegedly exposing sexual partners to HIV. And then the last thing that I really wanted to touch on is that the White House released in the epidemic strategy, he wants to end the HIV epidemic by the year 2030. That strategy, the primary tool that will be used in that strategy is something called molecular surveillance, and that refers to using the genetic material from individuals' HIV strains and grouping them into clusters, so that for the purposes of surveillance, so that they can kind of track and locate where the need is. If we think about that within the context of Missouri's HIV criminalization laws, that creates a dystopian disaster for people living here, because there's genetic information that can link you to somebody's HIV diagnosis. So those are that's everything that I wanted to, everything that I prepared to present. I know that's a lot of information, but I felt like it was important.
Devin, I wish you could see the paper beside my laptop right now. I took so many notes, and I've learned an incredible amount from your presentation tonight, and I wanted to thank you from everything from getting new language like sexual network theory and the self-empowerment movement and MIPA. I really want to thank you, and particularly what's most sticking with me, I have an exact quote written down, is that HIV incidence is really a matter of access to healthcare. And I want to thank you for your emphasis on structures, and it reminds me of a statement that's long been with me during my work as a social justice activist, and that there are no personal solutions to structural problems. So I just want to thank you for really putting the emphasis on where the problem is, which is a structure, and it's not about people. So thank you for joining us, and everyone who's on the line, if you have questions for Devin, please feel free to put them in the chat box, as well as questions for Jannis and for Representative McCreery. We will get to as many of them as possible, and I'm going to move us on to the next slide. So, y'all, this is so important. Please sign up for alerts at www.reproaction.org. That's how you can get invited to these monthly Act and Learn webinars that we host on a variety of topics important to reproductive justice. You can follow us on social media. We're quite active on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So again, sign up for our email list. You won't miss a thing, whether it's webinars, opportunities to take direct action in your community, hard-hitting videos holding abortion opponents accountable, petitions you can sign. So make sure that you plug in with us. We'd love to work with you further. And I want to ask you to save the date for our next Reproaction Act and Learn webinar, which will be taking place on Wednesday, March 13th, and that will be running from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern. Our topic next month is going to be Let's Get Real, and by real, we mean with facts about later abortion. There's been a great deal of hysteria in the media recently, and with abortion opponents demonizing later abortion, and it's been quite a bit and quite a lot. I say that as someone who lives in Virginia, and we've had a real explosion and eruption here, but it's taking place around the country, which we saw with Donald Trump in State of the Union, and he's continuing to share heinous lies during his rallies now. So that should be a good topic, and we look forward to seeing you next month as well. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Pamela for any questions from the audience.
Thank you so much. So we do have questions, and they are very good. So I am going to read these off, and then I'll hand them to one of the panelists, and then if other panelists want to weigh in, that would be very much so appreciated. So the first question is, are there any other diseases that are similarly criminalized, where exposing someone to the illness could lead to jail time, or does this only happen with HIV and AIDS? The first thing that came to mind was in my head when I read the question was Typhoid Mary, and how, you know, for people who aren't familiar, there was a woman in the early 1900s who had typhoid, but was I think it's called asymptomatic. She did not have symptoms. She was a carrier, and she was literally kept on an island in confinement because they did not trust her sanitary habits, and she was an immigrant. So there is a history in this country of that kind of criminalization, but in our current situation, Tracy, do you have any insight in that?
No, I mean, it does. I know it sounds crazy, but HIV in Missouri statute is the only disease specifically mentioned. So it's kind of called HIV exceptionalism, if you will. So what we're trying to do here in Missouri, as well as in other states, is we're trying to just take the focus away from HIV and have it be on intentional transmission of any serious infectious or communicable disease. So, so that's what we're trying to do. We do not think it's good for public health work to single out HIV.
Thank you so much for that. Devin or Jannis, did you want to weigh in?
No, I was sitting here trying to figure out if there was any other disease at all. And a lot of them are non-reportable, things like syphilis, gonorrhea, chlamydia, and those kinds of things. So no, HIV is the only disease that is mentioned.
And could you just for our attendees, could you just clarify when you say non-reportable, what does that mean?
Okay, I mean, it would be like, okay, there's a lot of statistical things that come along when you're reporting syphilis, if it's first stage, second stage, third, and it's very detailed, something like that. With HIV, it's something like that. It's very, very detailed. But chlamydia, it's something that happens common, and I think it's very hard to just try to pinpoint origin of it. So that's what I mean. It's not like it's not reportable, but it's not. Oh my God, I don't know how to say this. It's not.
So what we do, the way we describe it in statute is it excludes casually transmitted conditions such as tuberculosis or measles. So, so you can unintentionally transmit all kinds of things, just through casually, just like living your life, through things that are airborne.
Got it.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. That's why we do panels. That was awesome. Thank you so much for those answers and that clarification. So the next question we have, I'll read it off. I think it's really important that we're precise in this answer. Our attendee lives in California and has been positive since 1987. Husband had a blood transfusion during surgery when he was given tainted blood before they were checking the blood supply. I want to make sure I heard correctly. In Missouri, just living with HIV is illegal. And so if we could just clarify that, Devin, you want to take a first stab?
Sure. So it's not illegal to just live with HIV, but the way our statute is, it's illegal to spit on the ground. So the thing is that when someone accuses you of exposing them to HIV sexually, it really turns into a he said, she said, they said, because there's really no way to prove that you had a conversation.
Thank you for that. Jannis, did you want to add anything?
No, I'm good. Yes, that's good. No problem.
Representative McCreery?
Nope. Good answer.
Awesome. And I have just written down, they said. Thank you. So, between Aaron and me, our notepads are full. This is really good. So I wanted to circle back to something that Devin touched on about education and really drill down into, sex education. And I like to think about it in terms of a lifetime of sexual literacy. I think I heard that first at CCAS, and I really like to apply that. So in Missouri, we don't have mandatory comprehensive sex education. And that is obviously, it feels very obvious that that's a problem, both in educating the public about HIV and AIDS, but also in prevention, but also just a lack of stigma. And you know, when we talk openly about things, then that tends to be a really strong way to combat stigma. So Representative McCreery, could you just explain kind of what Missouri's sex ed laws are like, and anything else you wanted to add?
Well, we have a lot of challenges in Missouri. You know, and I'm a big supporter of local control because I feel like at least there are a lot of elected school board members that choose to do the right things for their school curriculum and make sure that sex ed is medically and factually accurate. We really can't, we've been unable to do that at the state level. So, you know, at this point, we're just, you know, fingers crossed and try to do what we can to help get people elected at the school board level that support medically and factually accurate sex ed. So, and I just want folks to realize one of the challenges that I have here in Missouri with updating Missouri's laws is, you know, if you just close your eyes and imagine what the average state legislator looks like, they tend to be older males, basically. And, you know, I'm somebody that became sexually active in the early 80s. So when I went through sex ed in school a long, long time ago, we didn't even there was never even any discussion about HIV. So part of what I'm dealing with from a public policy standpoint is I'm trying to educate people that never had any education at all on HIV/AIDS. Everything they know is just based on, you know, things they picked up in the media through the years or, you know, wherever they would get their source of information.
Thank you so much for that. And I have personal experience in Jefferson City trying to explain the difference between emergency contraception and the abortion pill. So I know there's a steep learning curve, and that factors into you know, how you can get support for policy. Jannis, did you want to add anything, or Devin?
No, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just offering the opportunity. So,
and I'm on my learning curve now. I'm picking up a lot of different, you know, information from everybody on the phone. So,
that's fantastic. So this question is actually for you. We'll start with you, Jannis.
Okay. Sure.
That, you know, Missouri, I often describe Missouri and most Midwestern states, I think, are somewhat similar, and the Upper South, of, you know, about three bigger cities, one mid-sized city, and then a lot of rural places and suburbs. So does the work that you do and have done look different in rural areas of the state than it does in suburbs or cities?
Yeah, it does, and it goes back to what I had said earlier about knowing the population that you're dealing with. So, excuse me. When I was in the Office of Minority Health, we naturally covered the entire state of Missouri. So, doing HIV work in somewhere like Sikeston and Hayti, Missouri, looks a little bit different than an outreach I would do in St. Louis or Kansas City. Definitely. First, I had to find people. So I had to realize that where I could find rural people, rural Black people to do maybe something with some women would be church. So I started to try and find out who were the churches in the area and who were church leaders and give me some big people names in the churches, and then, you know, like kind of cater my stuff to them. We did cupcakes conversations and, cupcakes and conversations for the rural area, and it worked out really well there. So in the city, I did a book club for women who were positive and high risk, so pretty much for women, okay? So, and that went over really well with, in the city populations, you know, the book club was a big deal, and we kind of made it kind of like fellowshipping. So yeah, so your outreaches look different for different populations. I would not go to a senior citizen building and dare try and show a PowerPoint, because the minute those lights go off, you just lost every last one of them. Okay, so what you have to do, like I said, is know your population. You go into the church, you better know the hierarchy in that church. You better get to know that secretary of the church if you ever want to get to the pastor. You know, she can nip everything that you have in the bud. You know, she will do that. That's what church secretaries do. They're in charge. So you have to play up to that person in order to get what you need. So now that I've told all my outreach secrets, that's really how you have to really figure out who you're dealing with. If you're dealing with whom you think it is. Older people are just like kids almost now, because nobody ever talks to them about sex. You know, they figure you're done. If you're 50, you're done. If you're 60, you're done. Oh my God, then, you know, it enters into something else. But that's what they think. So you have to really get in and know your population. And that is, to me, one of the greater points of success if you're doing outreach and education to populations.
That is tremendous. And I've written down all your secrets, including cupcakes and conversation, which I will be ripping off and sharing with my organizing team. That's awesome.
Yeah, and it works. Coffee, cupcakes, conversations. That was another seed. Coffee, cupcakes, and conversations.
See, the coffee is an important component.
You would be surprised. You'd be surprised.
I actually, knowing how much I love coffee and cupcakes, I'm not at all surprised that that would bring people to the room. So we are coming to the end of our webinar, and we like to start right on time and finish right on time as well. So I would like to take a moment to thank our panelists, Devin Hursey, Jannis Evans, and Representative Tracy McCreery, for your insight, for your information, and for sharing organizing tips, but also helping dispel some myths and hopefully give our attendees some tools to break down stigma and also fight criminalization laws in their own turf. So thank you so much for participating. I'd like to thank Ivania Woods, who is our Missouri organizer, and Caitlin Blenny, who is our senior organizer, for helping contribute to recruiting these awesome panelists. And as always, my awesome co-director for manning the helm of our go-to webinar. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.